Good evening, everybody. I am Dan Masters here tonight with my co-author and good friend Larry Strayer to talk with you about our new book, Echoes of Battle, Volume 2, Fredericksburg to Fort Sanders. Moving on to our next slide, let's tell you a little bit about the two of us. Larry, why don't you give us a rundown of who you are and what got you started in this Civil War business?
Well, that goes back a long time. I'm a child who was born before the centennial, and I think I was probably influenced by the centennial a good bit. And like anybody else, you played with soldiers and you watched movies and had your first visit to Gettysburg when you were 10 years old. And shortly thereafter, I started collecting and continued with my reading and went to college and worked summers in the National Park Service and had a chance to work in the Time Life series. And then in the early 90s, Rick Baumgartner and I started Blue Acorn Press, which specialized in a lot of Western theater topics, subject matters, enhanced reprints and so forth. And I've been basically doing it my entire life, reading and collecting and doing a little bit of publishing and etc.
So Dan Masters here. So for me, the Civil War, my interest in the Civil War really stems back to the very late 1980s when the movie Glory came out. I was 12, 13 years old at the time, and my parents took me to see that movie, which is a very affecting movie. And I remember my favorite scene in that movie, the one that just blew me away, was the opening scene at Antietam as I think as the Second Massachusetts is going into action, just how brutal that combat was. And then, that was kind of a golden time for the Civil War. We had the movie Glory came out, and the next year Ken Burns' Civil War series came out, and we watched that in my house. The whole family took that one in, and really it just as I went through high school, the Civil War was always an interest, but it wasn't until probably around 1997 that my grandmother and I were sitting down going over some genealogy, which is another thing I'd become interested in. And she hands me this Civil War discharge certificate and says, this is something for you to research. I know we're related to this guy, but I don't know how. Well, it turns out as I started digging into it, it was my great-great-great-grandfather, or her great-great-grandfather on her dad's side, who had served 3 years in the 1st Ohio Cavalry. So once I started digging into kind of his experience of what was it like being, a private soldier in the 1st Ohio Cav, it just naturally, kind of introduced me to this tremendous literature that's out there about this catastrophe of the 19th century. And I found myself getting drawn more and more into the experiences of the private soldiers. So I was Larry's, I think you were at one point a reenactor. I was a Civil War reenactor for a number of years, and then really started to do some more writing and researching and whatnot. I wrote my first book was a regimental history, which came out in 2002, which is now 22 years ago. It's kind of hard to believe. But have been actively writing and conducting research ever since. I do a little bit of collecting, not quite so much as Mr. Strayer here, but I do have a small collection of Civil War memorabilia as well. And it really is an enhancement to the writing process. So since really getting active with Columbia and Arsenal Press, which I founded back in 2017, I have published 8 books. 9, no, actually, I take that back, 9 books, and we've got my 10th book coming out later this year with Savis Beatty. But Columbia and Arsenal has done 9 books with a big focus on Ohio's contribution to the war, which is really what we're going to talk about here today, and that's really what the Echoes of Battle series is focused on. So that said, Echoes of Battle we didn't come up with this in a vacuum. We're really building on the work of previous authors and previous historians. And in the state of Ohio, we're very fortunate that Whitelaw Reid, who we have pictured here in the center, in 1868, just 3 years after the conclusion of the war, published this 2-volume Ohio in the War series, which gave a very detailed look at Ohio's soldiers, statesmen, generals, and that's mostly in volume 1, but in volume 2, which is probably the one I use most often, it's a detailed history of each regiment and battery, really going through what their war experience was like, what battles they were at and what marches they made. And he has some really good anecdotes and stories of things that occurred. So it was almost like, really a miniature regimental history for each. And our series builds upon Reid's work by giving the common soldier a platform to describe the experience of battle.
What made Reid's capsule history so interesting is Reid was a newspaper reporter, so his background was in the period newspapers of the 1860s, and he takes little nuggets out of these accounts and throws them into his summaries. And as you read that, it's very tantalizing to, oh, I wonder what the full story is here on this.
Mhm.
And one of the things that Dan and I had both experienced early on with Rick Baumgartner and I in the original Echoes of Battle series, there were 2 volumes on campaign studies. Dan and I were tossing this around, and as he mentioned earlier, he started researching and cataloging all the Ohio newspaper accounts from the war. And at present, there's about 7,500 accounts, and still, as more and more things are digitized, we still keep finding more and more things. And it's basically from that mine of material that the 2 of us decided we wanted to collaborate on this and issue a almost supplemental volumes to the original 2-volume work that Reid did.
Right. And really, so as we said earlier, the mining of these accounts, is really, it's become like a lifelong project. I think during the war, Ohio had something on the order of 210 different newspapers being published throughout the period. I've documented and cataloged the letters out of about, I'd say 48 of them. So the fact that we have 7,500 letters out of just 48 out of the 210 newspapers that are out there, there is still plenty of gold to be mined in this field. It's just, it gets harder and harder to get to. A lot of these papers, that we don't have digital copies of them. We don't even have microfilm copies, or some newspapers that are only available in really the original printed editions in book bindings. But yeah, really what this work represents is we've mined this vast field of documentation and really presented the cream of the crop that it describes the battle experience. But that said, the other origin of this Echoes of Battle series is one I'd like Larry to speak to, which was, and he alluded to a second ago, was the Blue Acorn Press Echoes of Battle series from the 1990s. So Larry, could you tell us how this series came about and how you and Rick collaborated on those projects?
Rick had done several works himself on World War I topics for about 10 years, and had moved out to the West Coast, and kind of felt like and as a career move. He was a graphics editor for newspapers, and as he liked to describe it, he felt like a fish out of water, being a Civil War specialist in California. And one morning he was literally shaken out of his bed by earthquake in Southern California, and it was like an epiphany for him. And he said, "I'm moving back east." After Rick got back, he came to me and said, why don't we do a book, with all these photos that you've collected and first-person accounts? And by then, the Ohio Soldier and the National Tribune were known to both of us, which is another large mine of information although a lot of those accounts were written 20, 30, 40 years after the fact. And as most historians understand, closer to the event that you have an account, the more accurate it's likely to be. So we did a combination of original newspaper accounts, the veteran accounts, letters and diary entries, and even some of the better written regimental histories when we put together the original Echoes series. Yeah, it's interesting that when we started the project, our original scope was, let's just do an account on Ohio and the Atlanta campaign. And that may seem rather narrow, but when you understand that Ohio had the highest number of troops in Sherman's army, and it was a 4-month running fight, so to speak, from early May to early September till the Hood evacuated the city of Atlanta, there's a lot of material you can still put together. But as we went along and researched this, we found more and more accounts that were non-Ohio, and we thought, well, let's expand it into the federal side. And then we started finding great Confederate accounts, and that's what evolved into those two volumes, which are more campaign studies from the first person narrative collection. And then, of course, I've always been more of a photo historian, although very well versed in the original accounts, but my focus has always been on photography. So that was another hallmark of that series, was to combine original vintage photography with the first person narrative accounts that we could mine up to retell the story. And we felt then, as we do now, that is probably the most effective way to bring the reader right almost into the battle line themselves.
Mm-hmm. And I think another hallmark of that Echoes of Battle series was the fantastic captions that were under the photographs. That just, it's one thing to look at a photograph, it's another one to be reading a quote from somebody that's in that image or was part of that regiment and kind of describing a little more what's going on. And as I said, a great series and really an inspirational one, which leads us into what our current Echoes of Battle series, which Columbia and Arsenal Press has been releasing over the last couple of years. So kind of rolling this back a little bit, for me, right around 2017, 2018, I got this kind of this germ of an idea in my head that, there are so many great battle accounts from these Ohio soldiers, not the individual letter itself. It just opens your eyes to what the reality of battle was for these guys. And I was thinking this would be a really cool thing to feature on a broader stage. And my initial thought was, okay, well, we've got Whitelaw Reid, volume 2 volumes. We've got the Echoes of Atlanta and Echoes of Chattanooga series, but we really haven't covered the whole war. I mean, Atlanta and Chattanooga are Western theater campaigns. And there was a lot of Ohio troops that fought back east as well, especially in the Shenandoah Valley campaign and at Antietam and Chancellorsville and Gettysburg and beyond. And I was like, it would be really, what germinated in my mind was, would that not be a really cool book to put the juiciest first person accounts for the entire war from Ohioans to really kind of focus on what their experience was? And I remember Larry and I, batting the idea around for a while, and I just started working on it. And in 2018, I kind of got to the point where I thought I was done, and I had this 900-page monstrosity in front of me. And I was like, there's no printer in the world's going to print something this large, at least none that I had access to. And then I was thinking also, well, if we're going to turn this into a book, a 900-page book is going to be really, really expensive, and we're probably not going to sell very many. So the first thought was, well, 900 pages is too big. And as Larry and I talked, it's like, well, why don't we split it into 2? And then it really turned into, what, to really do this right and to really go into the right level of detail and feature a broader scope of accounts, we split the series into 3 parts. So there's volume 1, which covers Philippi, which was June 3rd, 1861, is about the earliest engagement it was the earliest engagement that Ohio troops were involved in. all the way through the end of the summer campaigns of 1862 at Perryville, Kentucky. And then the next volume, which we're the most recent one that we released, is volume 2, which picks up from Perryville, really picks up with the fight at Fredericksburg, and goes through that tumultuous middle year of the war, where we see Fredericksburg and Stones River and Chancellorsville and Vicksburg and Gettysburg, and wrapping up the year with Chickamauga and Chattanooga. So really documenting the I'll call it the turning point, the key turning points of the war, with a focus on what were Ohio's troops doing during that time. And the fact is, they were everywhere, east and west. I mean,
that's right. And why Ohio? That all you non-Buckeyes might question. Ohio had the third largest number of troops of any state in the northern armies, behind New York and Pennsylvania. So there is a really literally a ton of material out there. And although I might make a point that most Ohio troops did serve in the Western Theater, which, as most people know, is west of the mountains. So we do have more to work with in the Western campaigns than in the Eastern campaigns. And we may talk about that at some point, that it did get a little more challenging to find these really graphic and detailed accounts from the Army of the Potomac, as opposed to, say, Shiloh or Stone River or Chickamauga. There's just a plethora of material to work with, and we could then really cull it down and select the very best.
So, part of this is, as we've put this series together, it's really part of a broader effort to preserve our past. That's, historians, as we do this, we're trying to document what happened before us. And, each generation kind of interprets these past events kind of with their own angle, with their own perspective. But one of the things that, as Larry and I's friendship has grown, is, there's finding letters, there's finding photographs, and then there's a whole nother level, like he's going to talk about here, about Lancelot Scott.
Yeah, Lancelot Scott. It was my introduction to him is when I went to Ohio University, and as I mentioned earlier, I've been a collector pretty much since I've been 11 years old, and so I poke around in shops down there, and somebody said, "Oh, you like Civil War?" I don't have much, but here, and he handed me a newspaper clipping, and it talked about a local soldier who had a scrapbook full of his writings. And I thought, yeah, okay. But as a pack rat, I threw it in a file called Athens County in the Civil War. And there it sat for forever. And but much later, in the mid 80s, there were up near Toledo, there was a big Civil War sale. And like most auctions, unfortunately, things went in a lot of different directions. And as my friends and colleagues up there told me, much to my shock, is that the man had been in the 18th Ohio, and his granddaughter had ended up in the Toledo area, and that's how this material had gone from Athens County, clear in the southeast part of the state, up to the far northwest part of the state. And it might have been the old railroad line had something to do with that, that went in that direction. But in any event, over the course of about the next 15 years, I was able to, through strategic trading and networking and so forth, reassemble this collection from this soldier's Lancelot Scott. The interesting thing about it is in that newspaper article, they mentioned this scrapbook. And after I had assembled a lot of the artifacts and so forth, which if you notice in the slide that's showing right now, that's one of the things that was preserved by the family, was his GAR uniform. And then, of course, the portrait at the center is him as a young man. One
of my favorite portraits.
Yeah. And in fact, this often solicited as a response from other collectors. Oh, it's a Johnny Reb because he's pulling a big Bowie knife. But really, you need to look at the color of his cap, which is dark blue. And it's a very informal portrait, probably taken during the warmer time of the year when it wasn't necessary to wear your coat and so forth. But both of us loved this shot. And eventually, through when the internet came along, I just started doing a little poking around because in that newspaper article, I mentioned a couple of names of descendants. Well, lo and behold, through several contacts and referrals, I eventually found Lancelot Scott's journal that he had, or his account of the war based on his journal that was in possession of family members in Colorado. And they loaned that to me, and so we were able to access that for some of our projects. And eventually, they donated to the Stones River National Battlefield, and they have a unedited version available online if anyone wants to see the entire account. There's a lot of detail, and Scott had a pretty humorous side to his writings, and so it's one of my favorites. In terms of the slide of him with his big Bowie knife, I recall an account he mentioned. He said, "Well, one of the members of our company were taking old files and turning them into knives, and my blade was about 10 inches long and much derided by the other boys in our company who could sport 12 or 14-inch blades." And I think that at the time we thought we would rush upon the Confederates and split them wide open like a fisherman does a mackerel. But after a few long, hot marches, we realized that any type of extra poundage was likely to end up on the side of the road. And
so that's likely where this 10-inch Bowie knife ended up, is somewhere on the road in maybe West Virginia or Kentucky.
Kentucky, Tennessee, who knows? But that's the magic that Dan mentioned, where we can sometimes get lucky to find a photograph that actually ties into some writing.
Yeah, to me, it speaks to kind of our job as historians and also as collectors. Is things tend to spread apart over time. I call it a diaspora. You know, when Lancelot was alive, all these things were together, and as he passed, different members of the family got, one of them got the uniform, another one got some photographs, one got the journal. And as those families spread across, a bit of his story is lost in that too, because they're no longer together. So our job as historians is oftentimes, finding, oh, hey, I found this great letter from Lancelot Scott that was in National Tribune or in the local, the Athens newspaper. And then you start putting these men's story back together. And honestly, this to me is like the most fun part of the research process, is when you start making those connections.
That's right. As a collector, there's nothing better than to reassemble pieces of a group that were broken apart just through normal family distribution.
So kind of speaking back to our research methodology for Echoes of Battle, kind of as we it put this together, a lot of emphasis on our part and relying on obviously the written word, not a whole lot in the way of oral history from that period of time. Obviously not much in the way of audio recordings or interviews or anything like that. Very, very little of that. So we rely very heavily upon the written word as recorded in letters and diaries and post-war accounts. So that was the cornerstone of it. But as we said earlier, the other big portion of it was mining the period newspapers. As I said, during the war, Ohio had something on the order of 210 titles being printed at different times across the state. And not every one of these newspapers ran letters from the soldiers, but a lot of them did. One of my personal favorites, and one that ran perhaps the most of any in the state, was the Western Reserve Chronicle out of Warren, which I think, if I remember right, published 484 soldiers' letters between 61 and really in the digital copies of this end at the end of 1864. I got to think they would have been well over 500 had the issues existed past the end of 64. Larry's hometown, Urbana, the Urbana Citizen Gazette published well into the 400s as far as letters. And it's amazing the variety of what's out there and the quality, the quality of the details that these men provided about what their experiences was. At times it was just breathtaking. I know in volume 1 we featured a letter from a soldier in the 80th Ohio describing in rather gut-wrenching graphic terms the aftermath of the Battle of Corinth and what it was like as he found this Confederate soldier who was lying out on the field, and he was a boy just like him, 18, 19 years old, who'd been left behind when the Confederate Army retreated. And he describes in graphic detail the condition this young man was in, and that nobody knew who he was. And, at first glance, they thought he was dead, but he was still alive. And I mean, just that this was in what amounted to a family newspaper was really eye-opening. But to me, it was written literally 2 days after the battle. And to me, it opens the door to like, okay, you all want to know what combat really is like? Well, here, let me tell you. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you read that and you want to walk away from it, but it is just amazing stuff that was out there. Larry, and you want to talk a little bit about, so we have the period writings, and then we have, of course, after the war, we have the Grand Army of the Republic and the Union Veterans Union and the National Tribune. I want to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, fortunately, right before Rick and I started the First Echoes of Battle volumes, Rick Sowers had been working with the National Tribune, which is the official weekly of the Grand Army of the Republic. It started publishing in the late 1870s and went all the way up into early World War II when they merged with the Stars and Stripes. That's a very long period of time. And, almost immediately upon publication, and by the way, they were based in Washington, D.C., they started publishing wartime accounts of the veterans. And they had certain columns they put the shorter ones into called Fighting It Over. Mm-hmm. And then those names changed over a period of time over the decades of publication. But every now and then somebody would send in a very lengthy account that they would serialize. And at one point, a couple of those accounts, Blue Acorn Press reissued as books, illustrated volumes of these accounts that we found in the Tribune. The one that comes to mind is 68th Ohio.
Hiram Loop.
Yeah, there was Hiram Loop's account, and there would never have been anything issued on that regiment in a more existing format like a regimental history. So we were able to use Loop and edit it and illustrate it. And that's kind of what we're doing too with the current project. But another one of the publications, of course, Confederate Veteran is very well known. In fact, it got attention long before the National Tribune did, and has been reprinted. And of course, Savas Beatty issued a great index to the National Tribune, 3-volume set that I would highly recommend to anyone else that was doing similar type research to get a hold of that. It just makes things really great. But Ohio had a 15-year run in the Ohio Soldier, and that was published in Chillicothe by John Raper, who was a veteran of the 26th Ohio, otherwise known as the Groundhog Regiment, because the amount of time that he spent digging in their positions, especially later in the war and through the Atlanta campaign. But I just love some of the nicknames that the boys gave their regiments: the Groundhog Regiment and the 14th Ohio out of Toledo, which is divided by the Maumee River. They called themselves the Maumee Muskrats. And of course, there's the more the wartime nicknames are a little more dignified than to say the post-war veteran nicknames. But again, the Ohio Soldier, a great resource, and there's other papers like that too. There was a paper published in Indianapolis, and a lot of Ohio soldiers drifted west, and
Western Veteran, which
yeah,
was published out of Kansas.
that's right,
Memory
Kansas
serves.
too. And although generally for Ohio accounts, you're going to find the greatest number still resident in the state, and the Ohio soldiers probably best for that. So. The only other thing that I might add to that is, as we went through the wartime papers, we noticed that as the war went on, the coverage of the wartime battle accounts seemed to get scarcer and scarcer. And this started in '64, and there's probably several factors at work there. Number one, the campaigns were more intensified, both Grant's Overland Campaign and Sherman's Atlanta Campaign. The troops didn't have a big battle and some downtime to write about it. They were just moving through active campaigning without much of a break. That was probably one reason you don't find as much. Secondly, the editors themselves and the reading public were probably growing a little bit weary of the long casualty lists and repetitive descriptions of intense combat. And then later in the summer, late summer, the presidential campaign took over most of the priority spaces in the newspapers. So it was a challenge, especially in the Eastern Theater, to find period accounts to fill in some of the bigger operations.
Yeah, especially in our upcoming volume 3, that becomes more and more of a challenge because we end up, the accounts start getting thinner in the newspapers. So we end up relying a little more heavily on, things like the Ohio Soldier and National Tribune to kind of carry us through the rest of that story, because the period documentation tends to thin out a little bit.
Yeah, and another thing that happened too, as a footnote, earlier in the war, there were far more Ohio units in the Eastern Theater, and after Chickamauga and the siege of Chattanooga ensued, and Rosecrans needed help, and the War Department decided to send them the units that were most highly populated by Ohio regiments, the 11th and the 12th Corps. So all those Ohio troops that had formerly been in the East were then sent west. And by the time of the Overland Campaign, it was reduced down to less than 10 regiments.
Yeah.
And that's based on both cavalry and infantry, whereas before there were probably dozens of Ohio regiments.
Yeah. Right. So moving on here, I think one of the things that we're most proud of with this book is, with Larry's extensive background in images of Ohioans in the war, combined with all the documentation work I did on the newspaper side, we're able to start marrying up images, the letters these men wrote with images of the men who wrote them. And we found that was a really powerful combination, in a printed format, to be able to, open a book and see on the one side, Captain Alfred E. Lee looking at the account that he wrote about Gettysburg, and that you can actually, see who it was that really was, able to. I'm looking at this letter here that Lee wrote a week after the Battle of Chancellorsville. It's a very intense account of what happened. Of course, the 82nd Ohio was in the 11th Army Corps, as Larry just talked about. A lot of you Civil War buffs will know that the 11th Corps was part of Jackson's, hit by Jackson's famous flank attack on May 2nd. Well, Alfred E. Lee was right there in the middle of it. And as he described to the hometown readers of the Delaware Gazette, he didn't pull too many punches about describing what happened. I mean, it was a very honest account and talking about, the storm of battle and just the horrors and the frustrations that he experienced trying to lead his men in what proved to be a very significant federal defeat. Being able to marry the two of them, I think, has been very rewarding for us, and obviously very, very educational in our own as we learn about the war and what it meant to these men. So as Larry talked about a second ago, some learnings along the path to publication. Definitely the soldiers' letters start appearing less frequently in the newspapers as the war progressed. The high point for letters, from what I can see, was early 1861 up through about the period after the Battle of Stones River, in which ended on January 4th, 1863. As 1863 progresses, a couple of things start happening that kind of cuts down on the number of letters published in the newspapers. For starters, there's the growth of the Copperhead movement, and really centered in Ohio with Clement Vallandigham. The Democratic papers,
the so-called peace
the
democracy.
peace democracy, the Democratic papers within the state just tended to run less and less soldiers' letters and focus more and more on really the gubernatorial contest coming up that October. And the soldiers' letters from a lot of these Democratic leaning papers really tended to disappear almost completely by, I'd say, the summer of '63, which is really unfortunate. I have found some of the best accounts that these soldiers were sending home were being published in these Democratic papers. So it's unfortunate, but that's just the way it was. But also, as the public just grew war weary, the newspapers, they really turned to other topics. You start seeing more things about Western migration and settling in Nebraska and Kansas and Colorado and things like that. And so for us as historians, kind of realizing that that our gold mine has some potholes in it further down the path, we end up turning a lot more to original private letters and these post-war writings to kind of fill in the void that the newspaper letters covered earlier.
Interestingly enough, we include this graphic of Cy and Shorty as foragers, and we kind of envision ourselves as kind of like historic information foragers.
Yeah, very much so. I was thinking too, we have a borderline physical resemblance to both. I'll take credit as Cy. So. Right.
And of course, Wilbur Hinman is one of our favorites.
Yeah, another Buckeye.
Yeah, interestingly enough, without digging too deep into this, but Wilbur Hinman actually, I believe, worked for a while for McElroy in Washington. Hinman was a journalist himself, and of course, his classic Cy and Shorty, fiction is considered among the best for dialect and also soldier life details. McElroy then took the story, embellished it, and released it in serial forms under his own name. And many years ago, I was speaking with a descendant of Hinman, and he told me that in the family yet they still have a suitcase full of correspondence over this controversy over who had the rights to Cy and Shorty.
So when we look at, looking at volume 2 specifically, really the scope of the story is covering some of really the bloodiest individual battles of the Civil War. I mean, we look at Fredericksburg, Chickasaw Bayou, which has been likened to a miniature Fredericksburg in the West. Stones River, which, as documenting in a different project, was more than 24,000 casualties. Chancellorsville, the Vicksburg campaign. For Ohio, 2nd Winchester was pretty significant. We had a large contingent of Ohio troops there. And then, of course, the turning points of the war, the Vicksburg campaign, Gettysburg, and the bloodiest battle in the Western Theater, Chickamauga. All of these are documented in in volume 2, and then we wrap up really with kind of the conclusion of the 1863 campaigns, by battles at Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge, and Fort Sanders, which was an engagement at Knoxville. But as we kind of talked about this, of course, as we write these books, we develop our kind of favorite characters, favorite stories. And as Larry and I were talking a little before the presentation today, his favorite story has to do with the soldier in the 20th Ohio at the Battle of Raymond.
Right. Raymond was many know, but for those who don't, Raymond was a rather small but significant fight in the Vicksburg campaign in Mississippi. And there were Texas troops that came up against the 20th Ohio. Henry O. Dwight, his material has been published by some of the mainstream Civil War journals, Civil War Times. They've serialized some of his things. And his account is located at the Ohio Historical Center in Columbus. But he also wrote this very intense letter, and it was after the war, I believe. But it's, in my mind, having read all the first person accounts that I've had over the decades and worked on these projects, his is one of the most detailed and almost you are at my elbow accounts that I have read. And without getting into it all the way, Dwight, who was a corporal at the time and then later rose to the rank of aide-de-camp on General Forces staff, which was divisional staff by 1865. He wrote this from memory and probably accessing his journal, this account that is just incredible. And they were up against the 8th Texas, and he said that those Texans would not move worth a damn. And they just couldn't get them to budge. Once they got in, they moved in so close that he could literally feel the muzzle blasts and the heat coming from the Texas rounds. The one advantage that the 20th Ohio had in this position was that there was a dry creek bed that they had just fortunately moved into that position before the Texans did. And that gave them about a 2.5 foot immediate breastwork, natural breastwork that they took advantage of. But by the time they were done, whatever foliage was there was just completely shot away. And look for that account and read it and see if you don't agree with me that is among the top, certainly the top 4 or 5 accounts in the entire work.
Yeah. Well, for me, being a Stones River guy, and being a 21st Ohio descendant, my favorite story is one that was written by a private soldier named Sam Linton, or Saul Linton, as he kind of went by. The local Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center maintains his original journal, which I think was a rewrite of his diary that he kept during the war. And at Stones River, the 21st Ohio was engaged with repulsing Breckinridge's counterattack on January 2nd, 1863. And Sam's account of what it was like as they were on top of McFadden's Ridge, looking over Stones River and seeing Breckinridge's assault coming their way, and the Union Army in full retreat in front of them, and talking about how'd the men keep in the ranks? How did they not, how did morale not plummet? And he talks about the bravery of a sergeant who's just, if any, talking to the men in his circle, if any of you runs, you're a damn coward, and, I'll remember who you are. So he's keeping the men in the ranks. And then when the order finally comes for the 21st Ohio to charge over Stones River into the teeth of this Confederate attack, as they cross the river, Sam's taking his first shot, and the man next to him is shot through the back of the head. He describes it, his brains flew out in front of him. And Sam realizes that he's been shot by a Union soldier behind them. They're men, remember, these are young men. They are just excited to be in just the thrill and the terror of battle. And he turns to Captain McMahon, who we actually have pictured here on the presentation at the upper right. and tells him, Captain, Captain, this man was just shot beside me. He was shot by one of our own guys. And McMahon starts, knocking everybody's rifles up to basically get them to stop firing so that they're not taking out their own men. But it just, to me, it just speaks to
Chaos of battle. Yeah.
chaos and random just horrors of battle. As I said, Dwight's a guy. Not going to take anything away. Larry said Dwight's account is incredible, as is Sam Linton said. But the book is loaded with these stories like this that you're going to read the account and you might just need to put the book down for a little bit and take a breather, because it's pretty intense stuff. Well, that said, for you to get a copy of this great book, we've made it real easy for you. If you go to our Columbia and Arsenal Press website, which is columbiaandarsenal.com, as soon as you get there, you're going to see on the right up in front, there's a link to click into our bookstore. Just click on Browse Our Bookstore. It'll take you right into the ordering area. The book is available in both softcover and hardcover editions. But also, if that's how you get a copy online, if you'd like to order one or get one from us in person, both Larry and I will be at the Ohio Civil War Show in Mansfield, Ohio.
First weekend of May.
First weekend of May, and we're both fairly active on the show circuit. So if you don't catch us at Mansfield, there's other events. I know we got the Wilmington show that comes up later in the summer.
In June, early June. That's Wilmington, Ohio. And we also try and have a presence in some of the Ohio Living History events and battle reenactments and so forth. But if you want a signed copy and you're willing to wait a little bit, I'm sure we can even provide that through the mail. But we live about 2 hours apart, so it's just be patient with us where we can actually get the copy to you have it signed by 2 different people.
But once again, on the website, just go to columbiaandarsenal.com, click on the Browse Our Bookstore, and Echoes of Battle. We have both Volume 1 and Volume 2 available, as well as several other great Civil War titles. Thanks for inviting us. It's a pleasure to speak to the Civil War Roundtable Congress tonight. Have a pleasant evening.
Thank you.